Welcome to part 10 of this YSL tutorial series on basic programming in Visual C#. In this part of the series we're going to cover how to use for loops. So the video is all about how to get instructions to be repeated using a for loop. We're going to start by explaining the basic syntax of a for statement, and we'll compare for loops with while loops, which is what we covered in the previous part of the series. Just as we did with while loops, we'll explain the dangers of endless loops, how to break out of a loop and how to continue with the next iteration of a loop, and then towards the end of the video we'll explain a couple of practical uses for the for statement. Specifically we'll look at how to loop over the selected items and all of the items in a list box on a form. So there's quite a bit to do, let's get started. To get started in this video, you'll need a copy of the project we worked on in the last part of the series. If you don't already have a copy, you can use the link in the description below the video to download a copy, and once you have that, head into Visual Studio and then choose to open your project from the File menu. You can either choose Open Project and then browse for where you've downloaded it to, or, if you've been using the project recently like I have, use the Recent Projects and Solutions list and simply click on its name in the list. When the project's opened, you'll see a list of all the forms we've designed in the previous parts of the series, and this is the starting point for this new video on for loops. Just as we did in the video on while loops, we're going to start this video with a quick description of the basic syntax of how the for loop actually works. And to do that we're going to create a brand new basic form that we can use to write that simple code. So let's start by right-clicking somewhere in the Solution Explorer, and we're going to choose to add a Windows form. And I'm going to call my form for loops. And then when I've added it, I'm going to use the toolbox to draw a very simple button on the form that will be used to trigger my code. So in the toolbox we can find the button control and drag one of those onto the form. A couple of basic properties that will change for the button. So first of all, the text on the button using the properties window. Let's change that so it says for loop example. And then we'll change the name of the button as well so that that displays or is called something sensible. So let's call this for loops button. All we want to do then is get into the basic event handler behind the click event for the for loop button, and the simplest way to do that is just to double click on it in the design view, and that will open up the code file for the form and give us the event handler for the click event of the for loops button. To begin a for loop, you start by writing out the word for, and then in a set of parentheses there are three different things you need to specify. The first of the three things is an initialization statement, and usually this is to declare a variable and set it to have a default value. So for example, in our case we're going to declare an int variable, which I'm going to call I, and we're going to initialize it to a value of 0. To move on to the next part of the three things you must specify, you enter a semicolon, and then the next part of the statement is a Boolean expression. So this is used to evaluate whether or not we want to continue iterating through the loop. So in our example we're going to say I is less than or equal to 3. So that means each time we process the loop, that condition is evaluated, and as long as the condition holds true, the loop will enter and proceed with any instructions contained within it. The final part of the three statements, if I enter another semicolon, is the update statement. So this is usually used to control or modify the control variable. So in our case that's the I variable, our integer. So we're going to say I++ to make sure that it increments. So those are the three parts of the for loop. Just after that we're going to open and close a set of braces, and then inside those braces we can write out any of the instructions we want to perform. So in our case let's just show a simple message box. So I'm going to say messagebox.show, and the message is simply going to describe what the value of I is. So I'm going to say I equals, and then concatenate that to the actual value of I. I can optionally say I.toString, which I tend to do, and then a semicolon at the end, and that will display a message box for each iteration of the loop. In order to test this code, we'll need to make a quick modification to the program file to make sure that the for loops form is the one that's opened up by default. So let's head into the program file, and we're looking for the line which creates a new instance of the Word application form, and we're simply going to exchange that for a new instance of the for loops form instead. So we can save that file and then simply run the application by clicking the Start button, and when the form appears on the screen we should be able to click our button and we should see a sequence of message boxes appear. So the first time we see the message box, the integer variable is initialized to a value of 0, and then it simply goes up by 1 each time until it reaches a value of 3. When it increments to more than 3, that will break our condition, so the next item obviously is 4, which is no longer less than or equal to 3, so our loop simply ends. So that's the simple principle of how a for loop works. You have a control variable, which we declared as I, you have a Boolean expression that evaluates whether the control variable meets a certain condition, and then you have an update statement that does something to the control variable. Just to get a clearer idea of what's actually going on here inside this loop, it can be useful to use a breakpoint to allow you to step through the code. Now, we've done this in several previous videos, so one quick and simple way to assign a breakpoint is to click in a line of code, or click in the grey bar next to the line of code that you want to pause at. So I'm going to click next to the signature of my method, the for loops button click event. If I then begin my application again by clicking the start button, when I click my for loop button, it's going to pause immediately in the first line of code within that method. So we can then use the locals window and then use the F11 key to begin stepping through line by line. So we'll see when we reach the initialization statement for the for loop. So that runs for the first time when we enter the loop. So you can see this new variable I appears and it has a value of 0. And then the next line will evaluate whether I is less than or equal to 3. So it tests the Boolean expression. And if that's true, it will then enter the loop and execute any code in there. So we only have one single instruction, which is to display the message box, and then when we click OK, it returns to the end of the loop. Now, the next pass through the loop, we run the update statement first, so the integer variable will be incremented to a value of 1, and then the Boolean expression is evaluated again. Notice that we don't run the initialization statement again, that only happens once at the start of the loop. And then this process simply continues. So we see the sequence of message boxes, and each time we get to the end of the loop, the update statement runs, then the Boolean expression is evaluated, and to determine whether or not we run the instructions again. So we're nearly there, nearly at the end. We can increase that one more time. It's still less than or equal to 3. The message box is displayed. This time through the loop, you'll see that the integer variable is actually incremented to a value of more than 3. So you'll see that it goes up to 4, which means the Boolean expression fails, and then we end the loop. So I'm just going to stop debugging at that point, but breakpoints are a really useful way to test what's actually going on inside these sorts of loops. Now, if you watched the previous video in this series, you may well be thinking at this stage that the for loop is really just a slightly more awkward syntax for something that you could easily do using a while loop. And it's quite true, you could easily create a while loop which replicates what this for loop does. If we have a quick little reminder of the while loop, we can create a new method. Let's call it private void while loops. And then we can create a couple of statements in here, quick simple while loop. So let's declare a new variable. So we'll say int I equals 0. So that's the initialization statement. We can then say while I is less than or equal to 3, and there's the Boolean expression. And then somewhere within the loop, we'd have to have a control statement, an update statement, that updates our integer variable. So we could say I++, along with a bunch of other statements that actually do something in the loop, of course. So quite right that this loop would indeed replicate what the for loop does if we wrote out the message box line instead as well, of course. So we could quickly copy and paste that in. The downside to a while loop, though, is that the three individual statements, so we have to create an initialization, a Boolean expression, and an update statement, all have to be written out completely separately, which makes it much easier to forget to do one of them, and I speak from bitter experience. The thing that's easiest to forget to do is to update the control variable, so that ends up, as we saw in the previous video, in an endless loop, because the integer variable never increases to a value of more than 3. With a for loop, it's much less likely that you're going to forget to do any one of the three things because you write them all out together when you first declare the for loop. So that's one small advantage of writing for loops compared to while loops. Now, although using a for loop makes it less likely you'll generate an endless loop by accident, it's still not impossible to create endless loops. If I just remove my while loops example, a simple way to generate an endless loop is actually to omit one of the 3 statements for your for loop. You don't have to specify all 3 parts. So let's say if I remove the update statement to avoid increasing the value of I, as long as I leave the semicolon in place, this is a perfectly acceptable syntax. So if I start my application again, what we'll find this time when the application actually starts is when I click my for loop button, I'll find that I just remains 0 and I can never ever end my loop. So again, I get an endless loop. I can stop running my application by clicking the stop debugging button. I could do exactly the same thing by replacing the update statement and avoid the Boolean expression, so I can remove the logical test. And again, as long as I leave the semicolons in place, again, that's a perfectly acceptable syntax. So if I start my application again, I should find that when I click on my for loop button, that because nothing is ever tested, my loop never ends either, but this time we see that the variable is increased each time. So again, I'm going to click the Stop Debugging button to break out of my code. So just a quick way to highlight that although it's more difficult to create endless loops by accident, you can still generate them sort of almost deliberately, or still, I guess, possibly by accident if you get your Boolean statements or your update statements incorrect. Just as we saw with the while loops in the previous video, it's possible to break out of a for loop prematurely. So if we add a statement to our list of statements in the for loop, we're going to write an if statement. We're going to check if I is equal to 2. And if that condition holds true, all we're going to do is break out of the for loop itself. So if we run the application again now, by starting it, we'll find, when I click the button, I'll see I equals 0, I equals 1. Now the next pass through the loop, I is going to be equal to 2, and because of our if statement, that's going to mean that the loop simply ends. Rather than breaking out of the loop entirely, if our condition is true, we could just opt to continue with the next iteration of the loop. So let's replace the word break with the word continue. Again, we've seen this in the previous video. And then if we start the application again, we'll find this time, when we click the button, we'll see the first two messages, I equals 0 and 1. When I becomes 2, we'll actually skip that iteration of the loop and continue with the next one. So we won't jump to 2, we'll jump directly to 3. So just like we can in our while loops, we can opt to either break or continue our for loops. One final slightly interesting thing you can do with a for loop syntax is actually create multiple initialization and multiple update statements in the definition. You can only have one Boolean expression still. So for example, if I wanted to declare another variable or initialize another variable, let's say int I equals 0, comma, j equals 3. Then I can also add another update statement that will modify the value of that variable. So we can say I++, comma, j minus minus. What we can then do is maybe modify the Boolean expression to check that when I is less than or equal to j, then we'll continue running our loop. So let's just remove the if statement and let's add a couple of bits of information to our message box. So I want to show after the value of I, what I'd like to do is have a new line which shows the value of j. So I'm going to use a simple escape sequence /n, which will give me a new line. Then I'm going to say j equals plus j.toString. So if I run this statement now, if I run, start the application at least, and then click the for loop button, I'll see I is 0 and j is 3, and then the next statement I will be 1 more, j will be 1 less, and then the next statement, because I will be 2 and j will be 1, then I is not less than or equal to j, so we won't see another iteration of the loop. Again, that can be easier to see if we use a breakpoint to step through the code. So if we set a breakpoint on the definition of the method or the event handler, we can then start the application again and then click the for loop button and we'll see we're paused. So we see that we've got, when we press F11 to enter our loop, we'll see two initialization statements run. So I is currently 0, j will be set to be 3, then we'll check that I is less than or equal to j, and if that's true we'll show our message, and there it is. And then we'll run two separate update statements. So I will increase and j will decrease. So those two things happen at the same time. We then evaluate the Boolean expression again and show the next message. And then the final time we'll update these two values. So I is now greater than j, so our Boolean expression fails, which means we're kicked out of the loop. So we can stop running that by clicking the Stop Debugging button and then close it down, and let's remove the breakpoint as well. Okay, so now that we've seen the basics of how the for loop actually works, let's put it into a practical context. I'm going to close down the for loops form and its design view as well. I'm going to head back to the program file, and I'm going to make sure that when we run the application next time, we don't open up a for loops form, we create a new instance of the Woda application form again. I'm going to save that and close it down. And then we're going to add some new code, not to the Woda application form itself, but to the Woda matches form. So if you remember from the previous video, when we apply for the dating agency, we'll see a list of all the matches matching our criteria. What we then want to be able to do is in the matches form itself, we'd like to be able to select the people we want to remove and then just remain with a list of matches that we're actually interested in. So if we open up the word matches form, there's one little modification we'll need to make. We want to be able to select more than one single item in this list box. So if we select the list box itself, we can find a property in here which is the selection mode property. Now currently it's set to only allow one selection. We're going to choose the multi-simple selections. That allows us to select individual separate items. What we're then going to do is add a new button using the toolbox. So if we go to the toolbox and we can draw another button on the form, and I'm going to change the text on the button to say something like remove selected dates. I'll probably need to make the button a little bit bigger so I can see all that text. And then I'm also going to change the name of the button as well, so that the button's name is something like remove selected dates button. Make sure it says dates rather than just date. Okay, I've just made the button a little bit longer so I can see all the text, and then simply double click on the button to go into the code file behind the form, and we've got the event handler for the click event on that button. Now we're going to write a couple of for loops to allow us to remove the dates we don't want to date. Let's start by writing the word for, and then open a set of parentheses and write the initialization statement. So we're going to say int I equals. Now in previous examples we've always said, or written an explicit number here, so for example int I equals 0. But in this case what we're going to do instead is refer to the count of items that we've selected in our list box. So we can do that by saying your matches list, which is the name of the list box itself, and then refer to a property of that list box called selected indices. Now this property returns a list of the numbers of the items that we've selected, so the index numbers of the items we've selected. What we want to do then is refer to the count property of that list, and because this list is a zero-based index, so the first item is labelled as 0 and the second item is 1 and so on, we're going to subtract 1 from that property. What we can then do is type in a semicolon and then write the Boolean expression. So the condition we're evaluating, the thing we're testing for this time, is whether I is greater than or equal to 0. Finally, the update statement, we're going to subtract one value from I, so we're going to decrement the control variable, and then we can open and close the braces. So this loop here will process the list of selected items by counting how many things we've selected, checking that I is always greater than or equal to 0, and then decrementing I. So essentially we're processing our list backwards. It's essential to do this for what we're about to do next. The next thing we want to do is remove an item from our list if it's been selected. And we can do that again by referring to our list box, your matches list, and this time referring to the items property. Now the items property returns a list of all of the items in the list box, and to that list we can apply the remove at method. Now the remove at method, as the name suggests, removes an item at a specific position within the list. So to specify the item that we want to remove, we have to pass in a number, which is the index of the item we want to remove. So for example, if I said remove at 0, that would remove the first item in the entire list box. Now the number of the item that we want to remove is contained within the selected indices list. So to specify exactly which item we're going to remove, we're going to say your matches list dot selected indices, and that in itself is a list, and we want to refer to a specific item in that list. So if we open a set of square brackets, we can pass in the value of our control variable, I. So this means we're looping through the selected indices list, going from position 0 to 1 to 3 and so on, and then we're actually retrieving the index number of the item in the entire list, so the items list. If I just close a semicolon at the end of that line, we will then be able to run this application and remove any items that we've selected from our list box. So let's start the application now by clicking the Start button, and this should display our Word application form this time rather than our for loops form. And we need to fill in a bit of basic detail, so it doesn't really matter what name I type in, it does matter what date I type in. So let's have, I'll say 1990 for example. I'm going to set my gender to male and my preferred partner's gender to female, and then for the minimum age I'm going to say something like 30, and for the maximum age let's say 35. Now if I click the Apply Now button, I'll see a message box just summarising what I filled in, and then a list of all of my matches. So what I should be able to do now is just randomly select a few different individual people, and when I click the Remove Selected Dates button, we should see that all the items I've selected subsequently disappear. So if I do that, we'll find that all the selected items have indeed disappeared. So I'm going to close down that form and then close down the welcome to Moda form, the application form, and then get rid of the output window as well. We could write another loop within this same method that shows a summary of the people we have remaining in our list. So let's display this on a message box. Let's declare a string variable which will hold the list of remaining dates. So I'm going to say string remaining dates equals an empty string. Or I could also say string.empty to do that if you remember from previous videos. What I'm then going to do is create another for loop which says for int I, and I'm going to initialize it to 0 this time. So let's say int I equals 0, followed by a semicolon. And I want to do this while I is less than the count of items in my list box. So I can say your matches list dot items dot count. And then another semicolon, and this time I'm going to increment the value of I rather than decrement it, so I++. I can then open and close a set of braces. And what I want to do in here is simply add the string value, the value of the item that's in the list, to my remaining dates string variable. So I'm going to say remaining dates plus equals, then I want to refer to the item of the list box, so I'm going to say your matches list dot items, then open some square brackets, and the index number of the item I want to refer to is contained in the control variable I again. So your matches list dot items I. I'm going to then say dot toString, and then add on an escape sequence. I'm going to add on the \n to add on a new line character. Once I've done that, I just want to put in at the very end of the method a message box that will display the list of remaining dates. So I'm going to say message box.show, and then instead of round brackets, I'm going to say your remaining dates are, and then another escape sequence, \n, plus the string contained in my remaining dates variable. So again, another for loop. This, by the way, isn't necessarily the best way to loop over the items in a list box. There's a slightly different type of loop we're going to see in a later video that actually is a slightly better way to do this. But it's useful to see that you can still use a for loop to loop over items using an index number of items in a list. So if we start the application one more time, and then I will fill in some rough details. It doesn't really matter about the name. As I say, the date does matter because we've got some validation on there to make sure we're not too young to apply. I'll choose my gender as male and their gender as female, and then 30 and 35, and then click the Apply Now button. Quick summary, I can select a few dates to remove, so let's pick a couple of different ones this time. Click Remove Selected Dates, and then I'll end up with a list of all of the dates that I have remaining. So there's a couple of reasonably practical examples of using for loops to loop over items in a list box. You'll hopefully find many more examples for that in the real world, but hopefully you've got a good idea of the basic syntax and how you can start to apply that now. If you like what you've seen here, why not head over to the WiseR website, where you can find loads more free resources, including these videos, some written blogs and tutorials, and even some exercises that you can download to practice your skills. Thanks for watching, see you next time.